All right. Hi, everyone. So, Lois and Shaniva, Nepo Lydia. Oops, I haven't been able to share yet, but I'm Lydia. And as Stuart mentioned, I did grow up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but my father's side of the family is from here in Tucson, the Pascoyaqui tribe, which I'm a member. And then my mother's side, with the Mexican indigenous community, the Huichol or Wirikuta people. So both of those cultural upbringings really inform my work as an environmental scientist, as well as an outdoor lover. I'm a trail runner. It's something that really influences my work, and also just a really important way that I've gotten to know the land. And so today we're going to talk about, as Stuart mentioned, Indigenous knowledge systems, sustainability, and then also mining the Sonoran Desert, which is the topic of my dissertation work. Let's see if I can. So here are a couple of the topics we will go through. It's kind of an overview of all of these different areas. I have a couple of questions embedded throughout the presentation, which we can stop and talk about, or we can wait to the end. How do you all feel about that? Feel free to chime in.
How about thumbs up if you would like the opportunity? I think we better do it on our reactions. Let's see, yeah, thumbs up if you would like the opportunity to jump in with questions during. Okay, let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4.
I see a lot of thumbs up.
Okay, okay.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll just, when those questions come up, we'll take a couple seconds and people can integrate, bring up their comments. So let me go ahead and get back. So before I begin, I am trained as a soil scientist, and that is a formalized process of going into the laboratory, but I think everyone inherently has those scientific capabilities starting when you were a kid. And so I love this painting by Lex Valdez. It's a digital collage because I felt like I see myself so much in it. That really, research is a formalized process of curiosity, of asking questions and poking and prying. And so all of you as community members interested in sustainability issues, you're already community scientists, and your observations and your lived experience are really important. And so I really hope that you continue to develop that. I'm really happy to see such a group here on your Saturday present to have these kind of conversations. So I just wanted to start with that. I also wanted to give some context of why I study mining and why it's important to me. So growing up both in New Mexico and the Sonoran Desert, mining has impacted places that are really important to me. And I think throughout the Southwest, it's important to talk about this legacy of boom and bust towns. So, booming, if you think of like Ajo, Arizona, and how it was this huge mining town. And then as soon as the copper metal prices decreased, it really became kind of a ghost town, and now it's being more revitalized as an artistic community. And so recognizing this history of metals and minings and how they influence our community is really important, especially as an Indigenous community member, where I've seen how it's changed community family structures, where for a while men left families to go work in these mines and then came back, and there was this series of imbalance in cultural perspectives, as well as now when there were busts happening, multiple families came and moved into a home, and that was what happened with my own family as we left. So it's this topic is very personal to me, is what I'm trying to say. I also just want to talk about a couple of big mine spills that have happened just even in my time of my PhD, right? So thinking of the Cananea mine spill that happened in Mexico, 2016, 2014. The Gold King mine spill happened in the Navajo Nation. And then when I go running through the Santa Rita Mountains, you can often find these abandoned mine shafts that are out there that have really influenced this work. And so recognizing they have this complicated history of our land, but also with Indigenous people, because we are often displaced from our communities to make way for these mines. So kind of moving forward, I go through another example of a mine spill is actually, sorry, I'm having difficulty there, is also the Mount Poly mine spill that happened in British Columbia in the first year of my PhD. And that was one where it was so much rain that came through. It was the 10,000-year flood that actually made these mine tailings, which is the waste that I'll talk about, so where I work in my research, actually flood, and it ended up polluting the whole river system, where salmon, and there's a lot of communities there, are subsistence fishers. So the salmon were washing up on the shore without any skin, and having these major ecosystem impacts. And so while it might seem like some of these are far away, these are all related to climate change, to ecosystem services, to food sustainability, to a lot of to soil health, to a lot of these different processes that, as we're thinking about how to be sustainable in our everyday lives, also thinking about those impacts of climate change. So first, before I go into those, I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge systems, because I think that's becoming a really important part of this conversation. And as an Indigenous scientist, it's really important to me that we braid together these different types of knowledge systems. So first, I want to recognize the amount of tribal nations that are in the United States. I am one of a federally recognized tribe, the Pascua Yaqui tribe. There are 567 other federally recognized tribes in the United States. And there's different recognitions such as state, Native Hawaiians, and other tribes that are not recognized. And it's important to recognize that because that also tells us about a type of ecological history associated with these places. So for me, for example, with Pascua Yaqui, we have a lot of, and Tohono Nation, whose lands that we are occupying here in Tucson, those have a lot of cultural history and knowledge about these ecosystems that often isn't incorporated into how we do environmental impact statements, for example. And so that's why recognizing these types of knowledge systems and recognizing the nations that we're working with is really critical to thinking on long-term sustainability. I also want to talk about how there's these two different types of knowledge systems. So when we think about Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge systems, it can be both qualitative and quantitative. So thinking about the importance of oral histories, as well as types of number generating processes. So thinking about how the abundance of certain plant species, for example, and the oral history around how those plant species were used. Now, oftentimes, this can contrast to traditional standard science practices, also sometimes called Western science, which is a much more quantitative process. We go out into the field to generate numbers. Additionally, in Indigenous science systems, the main recorders or scientists who are recording these observations tend to be resource users, so hunters, gatherers, those types of people who are, it's really critical to have good science for longevity of your community's health. Versus in standard science practices, like I've been trained, those observations are recorded by people who are highly trained professionals who go through a PhD or a master's program, right, to make these observations. And so that knowledge tends to be held in a very small group or collective, as opposed to Indigenous knowledge systems, which it tends to be knowledge that's held within the community, that's passed orally. And it tends to be about an area like the Sonoran Desert that's passed on generation upon generation. So you have these really robust oral history data sets, as opposed to this traditional science practices that tends to be, maximum tenure, because that's the way that granting cycles tend to work. So I think that's just really important to think about those two different knowledge systems and how they can be integrated. And so I often talk about my work as a way of braiding in knowledge systems, because I don't think one is above the other. I think they're both really critical to having a robust data set. I also want to talk about that Indigenous knowledge and data has a variety of different a variety of different types of names. Some call it local community knowledge or ways of knowing. Traditional ecological knowledge is one that the literature uses a lot. Historically, anthropology studies will call it myths or oral history. But all of these types of data are supported within the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People. So there's international policy supporting the importance of Indigenous data. And I want to give a couple examples of it and ways that it influences our sustainable environmental practices. So the first example that it's critical to me is thinking about oral history. And so this is a photo of some Yaqui elders and talking about some of our knowledge systems around the Rio Yaqui, which is in Mexico. And a really critically important river system that has been impacted by mining, but is also continuously impacted by large-scale agricultural practices. And one of the things I think is important in this is, just as we think about our data sharing with digital technologies, well, we have our own policies within how we share data, and that's partially who you tell knowledge to. And so there are some knowledges that you only tell woman to woman or man to man, and that's the way that we protect our knowledge systems. Another example, and this is one of my favorite, is thinking about the role of artistic practices in data knowledge. So this is some floral beadwork by an Ojibwe artist. And what's interesting is that in her village, you know, they make every winter time, it's cold outside because they're up in Minnesota area. And so they do beadwork, and they often bead the summer flowers that they have. And so what they've actually been able to do is every year, looking through their cultural beadwork, go across time and look at how the plant diversity has changed. And so now they're actually working with climate scientists to look at how this artistic practice of beadwork has changed in terms of the plant biodiversity. And so in effect, it's actually becoming one of the first naturalist guides in the region that they can look back generations and generations upon from this traditional practice, which I think is just really beautiful. The last example I want to talk about, another local example, and this is the type of basket work which are made by the Tohono O'odham Nation. This is actually one from the Gila River Reservation up near Phoenix area. And so what has been happening is that there's an area that they are making baskets, and it requires a certain reed that grows along the rivers. And so the cultural practitioners who make these baskets were going out and noticing that some areas that were actually next to a reclaimed river system, the reeds wouldn't bend properly to make these baskets, but those near the actual river itself were able to bend much easier. And so looking at how reclaimed water versus natural water systems impact the effects impacted in practice of their traditional arts was a really important way for the land managers and the tribal land managers and natural resource department to really think about different management strategies in relation to the cultural practitioners. So again, it's this process, this shared exchange that we always want to be having of cultural practitioners and natural and environmental professionals really co-influencing the practices moving forward. So the reason why I think it's really important to think about all of this is that Indigenous peoples are critical for conservation. The UN has released a report in 2018 that noted 80% of the global biodiversity is in a quarter of the lands that is actually managed by Indigenous people. And so Indigenous land management systems have also been shown through other studies to really result in higher native species richness, less deforestation, and less land degradation. And so this figure that you can see here is from a study that actually compared Indigenous lands versus natural ecosystems versus protected. And all of those, we saw that Indigenous lands were the ones that had the most biodiversity. So us as sustainability professionals and champions really need to be thinking about how we can work with Native nations and their traditional ecological knowledges and really support them to continue to have these as we want to support biodiversity and what that might mean long term. And inherently, I think it's important also to recognize that as tribal nations, we've been resilient entities who our historical contributions have really gone unrecognized. I think one of the most prime examples of that is really looking at traditional agricultural practices. And so me growing up in New Mexico, I thought a lot about Pueblo farmers and how they've had traditions. This is one of the first photos of it from 1912, but going back from the 1600s, these recorded archaeological evidence of these agricultural practices that continue to be practiced today, despite changing climatic conditions and more limited water resources. But that was not something I was ever really taught in my own academic pursuits about Indigenous agricultural systems or thinking about the soil health and what Native nations knowledge have been around that. So I really want to make sure that we think about that moving forward, to not leave certain segments of our knowledge systems and our scientific practice out of those conversations. And so as I looked at my work in mining reclamation, which I'll go a little bit more in depth in the future, I really wanted to just bring up who we really saw as experts to bring to the table and have these conversations. And so, of course, the mining industry, who are the major polluters, were critical to have the conversation, as well as regulatory agencies who are influencing the policies or enforcing the policies. And then also academia, which I was part of as a graduate student. But what I thought was really interesting is that the people whose lands are being most impacted, Tohono O'odham Nation and Pascua Yaqui, we were really left out of those conversations. And so as I approached my dissertation work, it was important, or it was critical for me to make sure that our conversations and our knowledge systems were incorporated into that work. The other part I want to bring out, because I think this is important, is also thinking about the NEPA process. And so The NEPA's National Environmental Policies Act, and it's really the process you have to go through for any major practice or project that's happening that might impact the environment. And so one of the things I want to point out is that when a project is proposed, usually, the conversation with the industry and with the environmental agencies starts up here, but where Indigenous peoples are brought into those conversations tends to be way down here, which many tribal nations really talk about is just far too late to be considered free, prior, and informed consent. And so really wanting to change that in the future as we think about sustainable practices and culturally informed practices to make sure that Native nations are really included in those conversations. Now, the other part that I want to talk about that is when we think about who's the most impacted by mining, just in our state of Arizona, we have 22 federally recognized tribes. Pascua Yaqui is one of them. And in Arizona produces about 80% of the United States copper. So it's a huge industry here, really critical. And Southern Arizona in particular is a huge hub for mining. And of those mines, about 48% are on or bordering tribal nations. So Native peoples are really a critical part of that conversation, but we've really been left out, and particularly having scientists and having policy and advocates. So it's another reason why I think it's really critical to talk about. And you can just see here as an example, some of these black dots are major mines, and then these orange stars are major mines on tribal lands. So just to kind of bring that to contextualize why I think it's so important to talk about Indigenous data as well as tribal consultation practices. Okay, so we're going to shift for a second. We're going to talk about soil health. And I am a soil scientist. I get really excited to talk about soil. And I think it's, in terms of thinking about like conservation and sustainability, it's often kind of seen as like the ugly stepchild in the process, even though really soil is critical for everything that we do. So just to kind of remind everyone why soil health is so important, it's an important part of regulating water, both water quality as well as water infiltration. It's really critical to sustaining plant and animal life. Everything depends on soil. It's also an important way of filtering and buffering out pollutants, and microbes are really critical for that, of filtering and buffering and immobilizing, making sure that those pollutants don't travel, as well as detoxifying. And then also cycling nutrients. So if you were growing something in your garden, you're thinking about the role of carbon and nitrogen cycling. And those are all going to happen within the soil system. That's probably why you add compost to your garden, right? To help start or catalyze that process. And then also a really important one is the physical stability and support. We're out here in the Sonoran Desert, so when we have a big rainstorm, that can cause a lot of erosion, right? But if you have plants with healthy soil, they're able to really have robust root processes. So really soil is important for all of these critical processes. Now, I just kind of wanted to go a couple of the 5 principles of soil health. So thinking about soil cover, so you really want to get plants growing out there so that they're making sure that you don't have an erosion, that those soils are out spreading out, and really protecting your garden, right? For example, you also want to minimize your disturbances of your soil. So a common practice that is actually really well known to increase carbon output into the atmosphere is tillage. And so wanting to minimize your tillage of your soil system and instead maybe turn it, but not do a till process, which can be really labor intensive and also really damaging to your soil system. You want to promote those roots and really help keeping your soil, because they're continuing to have all these important cycling systems within your soil system itself, particularly for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphate. Those are some of the critical nutrients that you have in your soil. The other part is thinking about natural systems and how diversity is really critical to your plants. So in Indigenous systems, we often talk about the 3 sisters story. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the 3 sisters are corns, bean, and squash. And so what's critical about that is corn will grow up straightwards. It puts out some roots. Beans are growing also in that system. And I should say the corn is putting in carbon into the soil. Then you also have beans, which are a legume, and so they put lots of nitrogen into the soil, and they also crawl up the corn. And then the last is squash, which takes advantage of the beans' shade and provides more shade for the roots. So again, it's really powerful, and it's not just found in the Sonoran Desert, it's found throughout the world of Indigenous people talking about the three sisters of agriculture. The last is thinking about integrating livestock and fertilizers into your soil and your soil health. So those are just some of the basics of soil health, and I'm happy to go into it more in the questions. So kind of going into one of my first questions is, and that's my dog Salchicha, is how do these soil health principles apply to the Sonoran Desert, or how are they challenges? And so I'd love to hear from you all about what you might think of there's challenges to soil health in the Sonoran Desert, or what you think is a strength out here. And feel free to comment.
I had a comment and a question.
Yeah.
One of the problems with the Western, or what you call Western Basin soils, is salinity,
Yeah.
as well as high pH. And I'm wondering how disturbing the phytosphere in the Sonoran Desert affects that salinity sequestration at all, and how the Colorado River water we use affects that.
So I think if I'm hearing your question correctly, Stefan, you're asking about the soil salinity and how changes to the Colorado River Basin have increased salinity?
Right, and in undisturbed Sonoran soils, how do they compare?
Yeah, so the typical pH, or rather electrical conductivity of a Sonoran soil is about 0.25 decisiemens per meter. So in order for a soil to be considered saline or hypersaline, it has to be above 4 decisiemens. So most natural soils in the Sonoran Desert tend to be pretty stable, but when you do have something such as high evaporation rates, you tend to see more salty soils. And so that's actually been an issue at one of my sites, is that the soils there are too salty for plants to grow. And so what happens is that when the soil is too salty, it limits the plant's ability to do osmotic uptake. So they can't take up water. And that's why a lot of those plants will die unless they are adapted to be hypersaline growing plants. And so having adapted hypersaline plants can be a really good way to take out some of the salts of places. So I don't work specifically on the Colorado River, but I do know that it has been a common practice with a lot of just even the Santa Cruz River of having hypersaline tolerant plants be planted in those areas, and being really selective about the plants in consideration of just how salty the soil can be and the water can be. And that's also something that they're doing with like the West Center and the aquifer recharge, is having hypersaline plants be able to grow in those areas. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I was also thinking about it in terms of the reeds that you were talking about with the baskets. I have one of those baskets. I love it. But that it's possible that the mineral uptake is different, and that is causing the bendability to change in that reed.
Yeah, that is part of it. Is I think the community is concerned that with the recharged water, and in particular, that particular area is being water flow runoff from a golf course, because the tribe has a golf course. And so there's a lot of concerns of what kind of fertilizer they're using in the golf course that might be impacting that reed quality. And at least from what's been shared with me and with the Akan belief, is that when you make a basket, it's really critical that it comes from a pure place, because when you gift a basket and you make it, you're putting health and prayers for someone. And so if it's not coming from a pure place, then you're not gifting them health. And so that's a big reason why the community cultural practitioners were really stringent on changing the places that they could collect those reeds to make those baskets for that purpose. And it's fine. The tribe was able to open up a different area along the Gila River for the cultural practitioners to go, but it's just something, as we mindful, as we are so appreciative of that cultural craft of how we manage those resources accordingly. So thank you.
Lydia?
Yes.
Along the lines of the soil salinity, the standard practice is just to flush the soil with extra water. Is there any set of microbes that are known to encapsulate some of that saline soil, and so avoid the need to just flush it out.
Yeah, there are microbes that are very adapted to living in hypersaline conditions. What I tend to see that is a more common of a practice here is adding nutrient amendments to the soil. So like adding types of compost that can kind of dilute out those saline conditions. But that there are, types of hypersaline microbes microbes can survive in anything, you guys. So it just is a matter of, is that the type of microbes that you want there in your environment? Because I think irregardless, microbes are always going to be present, but is it the types of microbes that you want that are going to serve those really critical functional and cycling roles that you want for a healthy garden or for a healthy ecosystem? So that's the difference, right? And that's why I would typically suggest adding compost or some kind of amendment is better than adding microbes, because you just don't know how they're going to shift.
I got a batch of compost from somebody that was extremely saline in a bunch of different types of soil, salts, and other minerals. And I'm probably going to have to throw the entire thing away. It's so saline. And I'm wondering if it will attract some of those hypersaline microorganisms naturally, and it might do something useful.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
If you can store those microbes.
Well, if they colonize the soil, would they be beneficial?
I think it's thinking about the proportion of the microbes, because I wouldn't want you to get the rest of your soil, your neighboring soil, also to become hypersaline. So I often think of, well, a great example that I've seen here is one of the mining sites that I work on. They started to use biosolids and apply it on top of the mine waste to see if that would help facilitate revegetation of the area. And what ended up happening is that because it was biosolids, it was very saline. They ended up getting a bunch of weeds growing there, and it made a lot of the other areas really salty because it was such a high proportion of microbes. So I think it's thinking of the ratios in which you're applying things. I wouldn't apply it all into one place. I would spread it out.
Well, that's fine. Thank you.
Any other questions, or should we continue on?
I've got a question, Lydia.
Yeah.
Are you talking, when you ask this question of the principles applying, are you thinking about the desert land around us? Or are you thinking about our gardens and landscaping?
I'm thinking of the desert around us. I'm definitely not a master gardener, but I'm thinking more of our Sonoran desert. And so one of the things that I really wanted to talk about that I think, or I guess what I envision as an answer for this question, right, is really thinking about how it can be, these soil health principles can be more challenging here because we have salty soil, so that was awesome, but also because we're so much drier than most places. And that can just be a really challenging condition to thinking about soil health, where I think a lot of these metrics were really designed for places that tend to be much more humid. And so it's a lot faster for things to cycle here. And I have a photo of my dog there because I think in thinking about soil health, a really important one is just even thinking about animal waste, and how long it takes to degrade here. You actually tend to see more like petrified animal waste out there than you do seeing it going back into the nutrient cycle. Versus I worked in Costa Rica, and some classmates and we read this book called Tropical Biology, which is all about the nutrient cycling in the rainforest. And what was fascinating is that their waste can decompose under 24 hours. And so just thinking how quickly those types of processes and nutrient cyclings can happen. So that was one of the main points, is just really our moisture and our intense heat really change these soil principles depending on where you're at. So I'll go into my next slide. So again, there's different ways to measure soil health, which we have talked a little bit about. But the overview is thinking about something like soil organic matter, which really thinks about how the nutrient retention in the soil fertility, how stable your soil is, so stable versus erosive. And then there's also these physical parameters, something like bulk density, water infiltration, and thinking about soil structure. So you often see soil scientists, we do what they call soil ribbons, and that's really to see how stable and how much sand, silt, and clay are in the soil, and that water holding capacity. And the other part of that is really thinking about these biological components. So how many microbes or earthworms are really important, ants, and then these ratios of carbon and nitrogen, which is something I do in my work, as well as organic matter, again, is a really important one. And that does tell about the capacity for things to survive in the soil. And then lastly, which we already talked about, is electrical conductivity, also nitrate, these important nutrients in the soil, phosphate and potassium. So again, just kind of wanting to go overview a few of the different types of metrics that we measure when we think about soil health. And then I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the soil microbiome, because that's what I think is really important. It's why I'm a soil microbiologist. Again, my dog is kind of my model here. But I think it's really important to think about why we should care about it. And so I'm not sure how many have heard about the gut microbiome, but the gut microbiome is basically this slew of microbes that are in your gut, and they really have been found to influence your health. Things from obesity to depression levels have all been associated with the gut microbiome. Well, there's also a soil microbiome that's in the soil, and in fact, it's been shown. Studies have shown that people who are often touching the soil, like gardeners, have lower levels of depression, which is probably why a lot of people during the pandemic have gone into gardening, because of that connection with the microbes it's releasing. And so I want to talk about soil microbiome because soil is not a renewable commodity. It takes thousands of years to grow. About 25% of our soil on the earth is degraded by things such as mining and large-scale extraction. And microbes are really responsible for this important nutrient recycling in the earth. And I think it's also astonishing to think about how many microbes we're constantly surrounded by. So in a single teaspoon, there's over 10,000 bacteria in the soil. And so I think that's really fascinating. And then also just to think about how many microbes are continuing to surround us. So with the pandemic, many people are thinking about the viruses and how to easily spread that. And I think many people don't realize that we're constantly surrounded by a cloud of microbes. Most are beneficial and very few actually make us sick. But those types of things to think about in terms of our health, both personally as well as in the environment. And so I really want to talk about too is how important these roots are, these roots and fungi and microbes all play these important synergistic roles. But often we talk about how to repair an ecosystem from something like mining. We tend to only talk about what's happening above ground. And then more recently talking about the physical parameters, but this whole aspect of studying the soil microbiome and soil health is something really new, especially in degraded lands by mining. And so I just wanted to talk about this, take this photo, it's from the University of Kansas, and this is a very famous soil scientist. But so he looked at the differences in agricultural roots, growing something like wheat, versus the natural types of prairie grass, and you can just see how robust those root systems are. And then within those root systems, there's all kinds of interactions of microbes and fungi. So really understanding what these interactions are and how they contribute to soil health and ultimately to human health are really critical. And I think I just saw a question.
Yes, I'm curious, do you have any more illustrations or diagrams about these root depths for, our Sonoran desert plant life, and also, how far they go into the aquifers for the plants versus the trees, etc.?
Yeah, so I don't have a diagram of that. There are other scientists out here who do, and I can give you some recommendations at the end, or you can have my email and we can further continue the conversation about it. Since my work is not typically just on the overall soil health, my work is really specific on the soil health of degraded land systems and mining sites. One thing I will mention is that some of my collaborators have found that roots on mining sites, it depends on the plant. And I've found that the roots can go down past 12 inches on mine tailings, which is not even really a soil. But they've actually found, she works in acidic environments, like the Prescott Legacy Mines, a Superfund site up in Prescott. And she found that actually the roots, once they hit the acidic conditions, they all start to go out laterally instead of going through these toxic environments. And then there's also things like soil biological crust. So I can't really discuss and go more into detail about that specific example because it's not my own work, but there are a lot of amazing researchers at U of A who can maybe provide some more of those diagrams for that specifically.
Okay, I will text you personally or leave my email personally for you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right.
Lydia, if I can make a quick comment. Danielle asked something about reaching the aquifers. I think it's important to understand that basically none of our trees tap into the aquifer because near the rivers, they may be 70 or 80 feet down. And in the valley, it's hundreds of feet. And I don't think very many trees reach that.
Yes, thank you for that additional comment. I'm going to continue on. So I think it's really important in the work is to expand these soil health metrics to really be more inclusive of soil microbial metrics, and specifically using a lot of the important quantitative metrics today. So I think, again, in the news, we've been hearing a lot about PCR tests, and that is one of the tools that I use, but I apply it to the soil health and soil microbes. And the other part I want to talk about is that it's this idea of soil health and including these microbial components is becoming increasingly important. And so as of 2019, the United Kingdom is actually giving farmers specific targets to hit for soil health, which is the first time that's ever really come up in a lot of the conversation. And so it's really exciting that we're beginning to understand these critical places or critical ways of quantifying what it is to be healthy soils. And then again, as an Indigenous scientist, I have to think about how we fail to learn about the history and the lands in which we study and occupy, and the local expertise around those. So I just wanted to also kind of circle back to that. So now I want to go into really which is much more of my area expertise, and that's mining in Southern Arizona. And so just to kind of give a little bit of context about it, large-scale extraction or mining in Southern Arizona is a huge industry. Copper mining is an 8 billion industry in the United States, and I think about half of that is for Arizona itself. But also, we have to recognize that mining creates these large land disturbances and generate huge quantities of waste. And so this is an open mining pit, and then this is also a tailing storage facility from one of my sites. And I think what's important to recognize is that though for every pound of copper, we have about 99% of it is rejected as waste. So we have these huge tailings facilities that we really have to deal with and figure out how to manage well. And another part is that the technology is really progressed enough to that we don't have a lot of issues of heavy metal waste that is typical in a lot of these legacy mining sites, which are mining sites from the past. Active mines have been much better about neutralizing these heavy metals and making sure they're not biologically available. Even so, as we talked about with soil health, it can be really challenging to reclaim these and establish vegetation on them, in part because we have such low rainfall. And a lot of the research around reclaiming these lands and repairing these lands from mining have been done primarily in temperate areas. And so that's where I found it really important to continue to study how we repair our Sonoran Desert ecosystem to something that's close to the natural desert. And so as I talked a little bit about mine tailings, I know that might be a term unfamiliar for many, but so mine tailings are the waste product of the extraction process. They go through a process of physical and chemical treatment that make them really finely ground up, about the size and consistency of cooking flour. And in windy days in the Sonoran Desert, it's really easy for those tailings to get into the local dust transport systems. And so this is actually a photo from a wind event that happened in 2009 in Sahuarita. And this actually resulted in a $410,000 fine for the mining company. So it's important that we figure out how to stabilize that as quickly and cost efficiently as possible to really protect our community health as well as environmental health. And one strategy that's often utilized is one called cap and plant. And so that's the idea of getting those tailings and stabilizing them with a soil cap from off-site desert material to stabilize those tailings. Additionally, establishing a vegetative cap on top of the soil cap will really prevent from any possible winter water erosion in the future. And so that's really the crux of what my research has been at. And so our research goal is to figure out what is the difference between revegetation success, and this is an area after 10 years, versus a revegetation failure in a similar area after 10 years. And so what is happening and what can the soil tell us about how to prevent these two different types of conditions from happening? And so I know one of the audience members already earlier talked about soil salinity, and that was a big issue here. You can kind of even see these soil salts kind of rising to the surface. So just wanting to recircle back to that. So I use, as we've talked about these different types of indicators, I used a series of biological, chemical, and physical parameters, as well as these above parameters, looking at soil plants, their percent cover, total coverage, as well as the composition of the soil plants. And then used a variety of high technique quantitative methods to really quantify that soil health biologically, chemically, and physically. And I guess this is a question for you all to think about is how long does it take to heal the land from mining?
The half-life of whatever the element is. And a little bit more than that, probably.
Anyone else?
The slide that you gave on, I don't know, the standards of measuring, I was too fast, but I'm thinking water, restoration of water flows, return of bird life and animal life, and then perhaps recovery of a certain height of shrub or tree that was there before. The kind of a snapshot before and after would look similar. That's what do you think of that?
Well, I'm gonna let Holly answer and then I'll get back to that.
Me?
Oh, sorry,
No, that
you
hand,
did
that
it.
hand was, it was
Sorry.
from before. It was a
Oh, okay,
question.
okay.
So I don't know. I would say it depends on what you're mining, where you are, like what the environment is. It's probably very specific to region but I don't know. Sorry.
Actually, Holly, that's exactly right. Like there is not a definite answer. And this is one of the things that we're trying to figure out. How there's no way to quantify because it's so site specific of what plants can grow there, what kind of metal was extracted, how much rainfall do you get there, how healthy is the soil. This is what makes this technology so complicated. How big is the mine and how much land do you have? And the other part is, do you have enough healthy soil to put on top of the mining waste? Is there enough available? So it's not a simple question. And this is something, it's really a technology that's just surprisingly just starting to be explored because we have a legacy. I talked a lot about these legacy mining sites. We have a legacy in the Southwest that we didn't repair these places. Right, this is why we have something like the Gold King mine spill, where we have these abandoned mine shafts that I see when I'm out on my run. And this is why it's really critical that we develop it and change those practices and think about the legacy we're leaving our future. So this is why I'm really passionate about this topic, but also it's really complicated because most people don't know. A lot of the mining companies are really excited that we are working with, sorry, I keep going on that slide, because they actually don't have metrics for measuring that. Basically what has happened up to this point is that they just have to cap it and then they can leave. They don't have to have something growing there. And so we're trying to work with the regulators and with the mining industry to really change what those practices are. This is going to take me back to traditional ecological knowledge for a second. Is there some questions?
Lydia, Are there plants that are known to take up some of the things that are in excess in these mine tailings?
There are, and that can lead to its own set of challenges, because what happens when you have wildlife feeding there? So I have, on my site, I've seen wild horses and deer, a lot of cattle coming there. And what happens when those animals eat that? And how do we allow that to accumulate and go up the food chain? So this is why you have to be really intentional about the plants that you pick to revegetate these places. And so I'm actually going to go into that in my next slide.
Holly, I've got a question on that.
Yes.
We're scheduled to take a 5-minute break at 11 o'clock. So how about if we take questions up to 11 and then you can bring that new slide on? Would that work?
Okay.
So I want to follow up on Trace's question. And I've wondered about this a lot. Paul Stamets, you've probably heard of, the mycologist, who's very happy about the way that fungal bodies can create living conditions for other plants around them, how they can also purify things like oil spills. So if there's a fungus that was laid out on a mine area and it sort of chewed everything up, do we not still have toxic elements there that are going to get blown away in the dust or eaten by the plants, as you say? Or is there something else? Is there a truly rehabilitative effect of certain plants growing on damaged soil?
So in the case, a lot of times with Paul Stamets, and his work has been very well documented and actually helping to clean up the BP oil spill. But in that case, those fungi were then taken to a hazardous waste facility. So the idea of taking up these waste is they accumulate up these systems. And there's a lot of research that is still looking at, particularly with heavy metals, how can you neutralize that? And that's where the soil system sometimes can capture those metals, but then again, you have this dynamic of soil microbes and how they catalyze something, and they can bind something, but they can also release it. And there are some plants that don't bioaccumulate heavy metals, which is what I'll go into my next slide. So again, it's really having to understand these individual systems and how their chemistry interacts with the chemistry of the site and with the plants. And this is why research takes so long, right? But having research that's really applied to benefit our ecosystem, our unique ecosystem, is really critical for the long-term health of the Sonoran Desert.
I wanted to ask you, Lydia, about water, how much water it takes in mining. For example, the Rosemont mine that they're looking at, they're saying that it would literally destroy the last riparian area in the desert Southwest. I mean, I don't even know how we're talking about mitigation when we've got a water crisis in this state,
Yeah. Yeah, and so Barb, actually, a chapter of my dissertation was looking at the Rosemont mine and the environmental impacts that it could cause, right? And there's a lot of discussion about, if we already have 2 active mines in that region, is it really feasible and does it make sense to have another one in that area? And I think that there's a lot of, in that particular mine, as we have really poorly understood hydrology of the area, I think that's a really important question. We have to think about the long-term lifespan of the mine itself. One thing I will say on the site that I work on, and I can only speak for this particular work, is that all the plants that we have growing there are able to survive without being watered or anything like that. But there are other considerations when we think about the water impact. So dealing with that mine tailing sludge itself uses a lot of water, and they have to constantly keep it wet. When you're out on a mining site, they constantly have water trucks that are coming by and spraying because there are fines they get if they have too much pollutants in the air. That's also a reason why the mines will actually shut down if the winds are above 25 miles per hour. They shut down because it's too big of a risk of these tailings and dust particles in the air. So, again, there are a lot of really big concerns around the water usage that these mining sites have. And I agree. I think that there's a lot of questions in terms of the impacts on the aquifer and the water feasibility of that area. as a Yaqui woman, there's also a lot of sacred springs that hold really important cultural significance to us. And we'll get into some of these conversations later on about if we're not mine, like where is a good place to mine? I think that question comes up a lot. Where is there a good place to mine? How do you trade off the environmental and the cultural impacts of mining? That is something I'm really interested in continuing to explore because there's not a clear answer on that. And as the primary users in the global north, we're the primary users of a lot of these metals, you should probably have the primary environmental responsibility of that, right? So we'll get into some of those questions later on. But thank you for bringing it up.
Lydia, you've got us all afire, I think, with thoughts and imagination. Let's keep to the schedule as a body kindness in case you'd like to get out of your chair, stretch a bit, roll down the hill, come back. We'll take a 5 minutes, so that would put us by my clock at 11:07. And Lydia, I hope you might stay with us for a few minutes past 11:30, but that'll be when we start writing our quiz questions for each other. I see some people have been writing their notes already. And we're looking forward to resuming in 5 minutes. Let's mute off screen and away we go.
There used to be a place called Environmental Research Lab at University of Arizona that now is folded into the department. And my wife used to work out there, and they worked a lot on plants that were going to be put on either reclaimed mining or on saltwater irrigated stuff in Mexico. And I was just wondering about how those plant systems that they were using for those extreme situations, you said they probably don't fit very well into the kind of reclamation work that you need to do. Is that correct?
Actually, my research lab, it's Raina Mayer's research group. And so I know that they used to work a lot with the environmental research lab. And I think it kind of got swallowed into my department a little bit. And so I believe that we've taken some of, not at my particular site, but my research group has used that knowledge and applied it to some of the legacy mining sites. So it is still very much being used and being tested and found to be really important. So thank her for that work.
Yeah, it was her favorite job I think she ever had till we had to leave.
Aw. Well, so is it okay if I go ahead and start jumping back in? So since there's a lot of questions, oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
And this is, again, I just want to show that this is one of the sites that's not growing well, and you can see these salts coming up to the surface since we've talked about salinity so much. So it is really important that we think with the plants that we're picking. And this is where the cultural knowledge of the Lenape Nation was really critical. And so they worked with a mining company to pick 33 plant species total. And they worked with the mining company and with the Bureau of Land Management and then cultural knowledge practitioners. And so they picked these 33 culturally significant plants that have been adapted to grow on mine tailings based on data from the BLM and from the mining company that are commercially available, but are also native to the Sonoran Desert. And so some examples of, creosote and velvet mesquite. Some from more of the consulting work has told us purple threon and desert marigold and desert globe mallow. And also that it's important to know that these plants have, at least with the creosote and velvet mesquite, have not been shown to heavily bioaccumulate. And as I mentioned, it's really important since we do see lots of cattle and deer up on these mine tailing sites. And so this is us out in the field with the tribal land monitor after 5 years on the land that's been leased from the Lenape Nation and the plants that they were very intentional about picking. And then this is on the private mining land 5 years after reclamation. And I will say that there's two things that are really important in these distinct differences. One, the tribe, because it's their land that was leased, they chose to put 12 inches of soil on top of the tailings, whereas a mining company on their private land, they chose to put 12 inches of soil on top of there. And so some areas that was fine, they are starting to get good growth, but other areas not as much, and are still really bare after 5 years. The other distinction I think is important is that you see an environment that's much more representative of the natural desert ecosystem. So patterns which we call gap and plant. So you see plants, these or also islands of fertility, so lots of plants, and then bare patterns or bare patches, which is much more representative of this natural Sonoran Desert ecosystem versus some of these private mining areas where you see lots of grasses growing, but not really more complex and dynamic plant systems like you would see in these other areas. So we are just seeing in the first 5 years some very significant differences. And so I just kind of wanted to give, again, a little bit of a timeline. This area was seeded in 2009. When we started sampling, it was 5 years. And now at this point, we have about 11 years of data of the Sarko mission mine. And this is the area that we're primarily sampling on. That's Lisan Otham Nation. All of this northern section is Otham land. And then the other area that we were sampling was this area here that I showed in the previous pictures that is struggling a little bit more. And as you can see, it's right across the way from Sawarita. And then just kind of an overview, we broke it up into transects. All of this, again, is capped with 12 inches of soil. It's unirrigated. They all have the same seed mix. But what we see is these really interesting dynamics where these northern portions, which had the lower part of soil with less healthy soil, we believe, being really dominated by grasslands after 11 years of growth. But these southern sections having much more of these complex patch and gap dynamics with more shrubs, even within the same mix on all the same Otham land. So even so, with one area, we're seeing really interesting plant diversity patterns, which then allowed us to go through and look at the soil and look at what's happening below ground that might be able to account for these. And I didn't want to be too data heavy for today, so I'm just talking about the DNA biomass. And this is a lot of data, so let me start. This is the first year of sampling, which represents 5 years after it was seeded. And we saw that one area in particular was statistically much higher in the soil DNA biomass compared to the other 3 areas, which were those 4 treatment areas before that I showed beforehand. And then we calculated those differences, but then we also looked at the temporal change over 5 years or 6 years. And so then we also saw some really interesting patterns where these 3 areas that started much lower, most of them increased statistically with time. But this one that started much higher, the southwest portion, did actually not really statistically significantly changed. We saw a difference between year 1 and year 5. Same with this other topsoil one, the southeast. But these other areas that had the subsoil, which are those dominated by grasses, those did not statistically change over time. So seeing really interesting patterns of how to quantify that and what those might mean is some of the work that we did in this area. And I'm working on a paper for this.
Lydia, we're getting some mic problems.
Oh, okay.
And the last couple of sentences got hit by a lot of static. I wonder if...
I believe that's because Carol is unmuted. We've been getting feedback from her even during the break.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sharia.
Okay, I'll fix that.
And I'm just seeing, I'm sorry, sometimes I can't see your questions, but I'm just seeing that there's some questions from Stefan about how we establish baseline qPCR for undisturbed soil microbiome. And so that is, I'm gonna go back a slide so I can address that and actually have it right here. But we actually collect a sample from the natural desert ecosystem that has not been disturbed by the mining. And we have a triplicate set of samples that we collect from there. And then we compare that to the soil capped areas. So that's how we really compare those differences. And it is true, it can be very, very challenging to get consistent qPCR data. I spent like 2 years in the lab working on this. It's why I've only included, I didn't really present today, but in my work, I've only really focused on bacteria, not on fungi, because I had a lot more of a challenging time with fungi. But I hope that does answer that question. I'm sorry, I just caught it right now.
Yeah, mostly I was actually a little more technical as to what markers you were using to establish the the range of diversity in that ecosystem?
The range of diversity. So I did not look at microbial species richness. I only looked at abundances.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. And then, sorry, I'm just kind of going back to the question. So what is being done about the water toxicity that pools in mines? So there, at least at this particular site, there, at least not that I've been aware of having wildlife found dead around the water in the mines. I know that has been an issue. Another mine in the Biotic district on the Untitled Nation, that's just closer up to Phoenix area. And there they are doing a whole mitigation strategy and trying to address the toxicity in the water quality that has not been an issue at this particular site. And I know so the Biotic district of the Untitled Nation, they actually have their water trucked in now because their groundwater is so polluted. And so again, this is why we have to think about the ecological costs of our modern lifestyle, right? Of having our cell phones and technologies. And who it's most impacting. And I can't really speak more to that other than I know some of the people in the Natural Resource Department who are addressing that. You see, so one of the most well-known mine pits in the world is called the Berkeley mine. And there they actually have like loud horns 24 hours a day to keep birds off of there because a lot of migrating birds try to sit on that water and end up dying from it. Again, that hasn't been found at this particular site, but I'm very well aware that it does happen in a lot of places, including here in the Sonoran Desert. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So I also wanted to have a conversation as we talk about mining. How is mining land used? How is it typically used post-mining? And so there's a couple of things we see, like this particular area I'm working on, that it becomes kind of in this option, a park where wildlife roams around and they're not quite sure if they want to develop it any further. There's been some conversations about turning it into a solar energy farm, which has its own set of challenges. That area of land is also what's called allotment land. And so for those of you unfamiliar, allotment land is federal Indian land. It's a type of title. It's held in community trust, and any decisions that are decided around what to use that land for, the whole community has to decide, so it can have a lot of challenges. There have been conversations about potentially turning it into like a recreational trail. That's a very common use of former mines in a lot of parts of the country. And so for example, there's a lot of mines up in Minnesota and also Kentucky that have been made into huge mountain biking trails. And so as outdoor recreation is also a big industry in the Sonoran Desert, that is an option that's been talked about. They have used some of the areas into a discovery center, a museum, to really talk about this history of mining the Sonoran Desert. I think that's something we want to consider in long term, but also making sure that there's no way any of these kind of contaminants can become biologically available into the air. And the other part I'll just kind of circle back to is the solar energy part is, solar panels require a lot of metals in them. But on the other hand, these mining sites do have a lot of critical infrastructure already in place to make them really feasible for solar energy farms. So there is an interesting kind of return to cycle in that way of these metals mined to make solar panels can be a good potential solution. So I guess that's kind of where I'll see that. Sorry, I'm seeing, and yeah, there's a zip line at the gold mine in Oracle. So there are a couple of different strategies that those are being used. So that made me want to go into this conversation around greenwashing. And I think that's an important concept just in terms of thinking about how we use metals in our everyday life, how it relates to the waters that we use. I think all of us thinking about sustainability, I really want to be conscious of what greenwashing is. So just kind of a general overview of greenwashing. It's a process of conveying a false impression around a company's sustainability process and what that might mean. And it can be perceived as an unsubstantiated claim to really deceive consumers into thinking the products are environmentally conscious or environmentally friendly. And so this is going to kind of come to our next question is, and this is initially talking about a group, but I think for all of us to really think about examples of greenwashing. So now let's kind of have a discussion about that.
I think the one that comes to mind right now is the Rolling Stone article about the plastics industry and the putting, symbols to be able to recycle plastic on the bottom of plastic, so we all wouldn't feel guilty buying bottled water. And really, they understood from the beginning that the viability of recycling all that plastic was just not going to make any sense. So that's greenwashing for sure, right?
They've done that twice now. They did it
Yeah.
way back in the late 20th century, and then they're doing it again, trying to convince us that, it's recyclable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My question previously too, back on soil, might relate to this, because when you're talking about soil and agriculture, right, there are chemical companies that are totally tied to that industry. And so and greenwashing might be exactly what they're doing. I don't know. But when you're talking about soil health and microbiomes, are they moving in that direction? And is it authentic, or is it just greenwashing? Does that question make sense? Like, just when I think about soil health, right, you're going to talk about synthetic fertilizers. And so what are they going to have, like synthetic soil probiotics or something? Like, I don't know, like, because those industries, I mean, we're always vying against them.
Right.
And instead of recognizing, like with the mine, does it make sense to have an entire community against you, or to really come up with, something like where the money best spent, right? I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm really tired. But anyways, I had a question about soils and chemical companies, and I wonder about the greenwashing because they're not going to go away if we change agricultural practices, right? They're going to want to be involved and make profits. So how does that work together?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it's something, and as a student and as a Native student in particular, and seeing how certain of these big global companies have come into my community, impacted with Indigenous agricultural practices and with the mines, that I think about a lot. And I go to these conferences, the Soil Science Society of America conference, right? And like the major funders for a lot of these conferences tend to be Bayer Corp, for example. And it makes you really think about the technologies that are being developed and how those might be utilized in the future. And an example I have is a former graduate student who was here before me. He started his own microbial company looking for plant growth promoting bacteria to sell to farmers, and then ended up getting bought by Monsanto. And him being like, man, I don't know, I made this really great technology and it's great, it's gonna be available, but it's like by Monsanto, So I think that those are the kind of questions. I know a lot of students, myself included, I'm doing sustainable mining, and what does that really mean, sustainable mining? And that's gonna be kind of something we're gonna come back to in our sustainability section of the conversation. But what are these terms when we talk about green, these ecologically conscious terms and wanting to work with these industries to make them more green? What does that mean? And is that really possible? And what are the trade-offs of those? I think are really important. And yeah, someone put in the comments, Robin put in about smart technologies means massive lithium mines. And that's something I think about a lot. That's why I brought up the question around solar panels. I think solar energy is great. But when we talk about renewable energy, is it really renewable if it's continuing to extract from our ecosystems? And is it addressing, there's a great book, I think it's called Greenwashing or Green Tech or Sustainable, it's about sustainable technology, but they really give out the point of, is it an issue of having green technologies, or is it around really thinking about how much we consume and reducing that part, right? And I think that's, as we talk about the recycling symbol, that's the first part that many people forget, is that reduce component.
Lydia, on that note, Diana Liverman, who's one of the leads in UA on climate issues, said years ago that, yeah, population is an issue, but even more important is consumption. And there's a book that was done a few years ago now called The Conundrum. And there's a journalist who tracks how so many of our energy conservation efforts have not led to less energy being expended per capita, but rather to people finding more ways to use energy more efficiently. And I've got a question going back to recycling. Trace has often mentioned that there's a lot of wealth in our landfills. Do you know anything about the mining of landfills for copper and other precious metals?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you for bringing it up. So actually one of my lab mates or colleagues now, so that was a lot of his dissertation work, is actually going through and looking at how many people will often throw away metals like electronics, right? And so being able to go back through and recycle those. And his whole theory, which I'm uncertain about, but he's actually like buying up dumps, because he's like, those are going to be the gold mines of the future. And I work with mines, right? And so it's interesting how some mining companies, there's one of the byproducts of the extraction after they put in the detonator and they explode the land material. There's one byproduct, it's called waste rock. And so waste rock, it gets piled up into big waste rock dumps. And some places, some mining companies don't want to revegetate those because there's a potential that waste rock material holds enough metals that are going to become economically viable in the future as the demand for these metals increase. And so really thinking about how we develop these sustainable technologies while being mindful of how valuable a lot of the waste that we have today might be in the future. And so I think it's a really interesting question and of how we manage those wastes, and even in how we recycle a metal like copper. What I found really interesting in pursuing this research is that actually 80% of the copper that are produced, 80% of that actually gets reused. And so we're constantly in a demand for more copper because it's the best semiconductor we have, and it is constantly in more demand. And so we have this 20% gap that we really need to fill. And how do we make room for that in the future, as we are investing more in solar energy and other types of technologies, and we just don't have a better semiconductor at this point. So I'm going to move on to the next question. I think there's a lot of really great conversations, but I know we're running close on time, and I just want to get through this next part. So Stephanie, and I'll come back to your question. Okay, so again, I wanted to make that distinction between greenwashing and versus green marketing. So honest, transparent about the products, thinking about what they're using in terms of ozone depleting substances, how recycled they are, if they're made from renewable materials, even thinking about, like I buy Patagonia and they have recycled cotton, but is that the best viable option? Thinking about how much pesticides they put into the cycle, how much water they use, all of those types of things. What I have seen some fashion companies, including Patagonia, for example, is that they're now developing technologies to take the waste products from other companies, like leggings, for example, and be able to manufacture that and repurpose it to something more sustainable. Thinking about the packaging that comes with materials. I'm sure you've all thought about so many of these things, but I just kind of wanted to make that distinction as well. And then kind of talk about these sins of the greenwashing. Not talking about the trade-off or the proof. So really looking at companies' economic and environmental impact statements that they're talking about. And again, just kind of thinking about the water consumption and the pesticides that go into producing these products that we like. And then also, I think recognizing a lot of these companies know that talking about sustainability is the cool thing to do now, but how is that changing their practices? And this is where I kind of come back to this idea of sustainable mining. What does that mean when it's sustainable mining? Who is it sustainable for? And this is, again, talking about the increase in demand for copper. This is rather old data that my advisor used, but it is continuing to uptick. And I'll just share with you all, I was at a conference here at the University of Arizona, and I know I wouldn't be in this space if it wasn't a PhD student. As a Yaqui community member, I would not be invited to these spaces, but it was really important for me to think, sorry, you guys. It was really important for me to recognize kind of that privilege of being a student can allow, as they talked about the future of the Sonoran Desert and it becoming the Silicon Valley of mining. And that was a really hard thing for me to stomach, right? To think about, what that means for them, what that means for me as a Yaqui community member. And so thinking about how this increase in demand for metals is going to change our community here is really personal. And so again, thinking about where do these metals come from and who do they impact most, right? And so here you see us, the Sonoran Desert, these sacred veins of metals, but how much it's impacting our community. And if it's not mined here, where is it getting exported to? Where is the production and extraction of those metals being exported to? And what are their environmental standards and their workers' protections? And if we're the primary consumers of those metals, is that the best place? Should we be carrying the environmental burden of it? I think those are all really important questions as we think about these. So we see a lot of these mines happening in Latin America, South America, and Latin America. They don't have the same kind of environmental protections, and they don't have the same types of worker protections. So those are things we want to think about when we think about sustainability. So this is like the last things. I know many of you have already thought about this topic about what is sustainability. That's why you're in this bachelor's training. But I really want to hear from you all. What is sustainability to you? And what do you think about when you hear that term?
Lydia, I guess want to ask sort of the same question of you. What do you think Indigenous practices offer in terms of how we create a sustainable Tucson?
Yeah, and that is going to be one of my slides. I don't know if I should go into it now. I guess maybe
Lydia,
we'll
if you want to let people answer first, Lydia, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Barb?
I think sustainability, when they talk about mining jobs, they act like it's going to be booming for the economy, but they always go away. You have these areas where they've mined and then the economy tanks, and then there's these towns that are just they're essentially mining towns that they're gone. So that's not sustainable right there in my book.
That's the dynamic I was talking about, the boomer bust dynamic, right?
Right, exactly.
We see throughout the Southwest, yeah.
Yeah, they do the same with the pipelines. Those jobs aren't, oh yeah, really great paying jobs, hundreds and thousands of jobs, and then they're gone. Then what do you do?
And how are they building capacity in our community too, right? To extend beyond them. That's a big question. Yeah.
Lydia, I think one of the big problems that you probably have had to address too in your discussions is, what are the metrics for sustainability? Sustainability is like quality. I used quality assurance as a large part of my career. And quality can mean whatever you want it to mean. Without metrics, it's a problem. So I think the idea of finding exactly what the whole cycle is of any given metal or a material, and the metrics of how you measure that is really important. And that's something that doesn't seem to be readily available in easily digestible form. And I'm not sure how to address that, other than I know there are people doing this, but there doesn't seem to be an overarching database where you can find out what it costs in terms of all of these types of issues from start to finish in the cycle.
Yeah, you often see 5-year plans, but you don't see how they're being implemented and how they're hitting those goals, right? In sustainability. And I think like for so long, it was sufficient to say like, we're being sustainable, but now as climate change is impacting us and we're really feeling it, that question of how are you measuring what progress is really critical. So thank you for that point.
And it gets into the greenwashing question as well. I, for example, I bought a cotton blanket the other day. It says we do this sustainably. And I checked back through the ownership of the companies. And it basically comes back to a company in Sumatra that is clearing forests to plant bamboo to make this sustainable product, and cotton as well to make that sustainable product. And they have a horrible record of anything. So until you find out who's doing what and where they are in the cycle, it's really hard to accept claims of sustainability.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I work in packaged consumer goods and it's exactly the same. All of the eco-friendly products, most, I mean, there's, but that are sold, at Target, Whole Foods, like if you trace them back, they're owned by Lever Brothers, Johnson & Johnson, and Colgate-Palmolive. Because that's the model, right? Kind of like you were talking about the young man that sold his technology to Monsanto, right? Burt's Bees used to be teeny, and now Burt's Bees is huge, and that's because Burt's Bees was purchased by. So yeah, and it's tricky as consumers. I used to think of sustainability as kind of this micro power of my own mindset and consumerism, and I do think that's made a change. I have done a lot of work with food products and children, and there's a lot of choices for medication for children now that don't have dyes in them, and I was like a beginning of that. However, that is not the impact of that is people who can afford to buy those products, and it's not a larger. And so I think we have to somehow upscale it, and that is about systemic change, truly, I think. And I'm also reading a book, I don't know if this relates, but about racism. And the thoughts are about segregation, integration, and anti-racism. And I was thinking about that as you were speaking, right? What is the next stage in environmentalism, where it really is impacting, right? It can't just be first world countries. It's just so much bigger than that. Even my time in Africa, if anybody's ever interested, I can talk to you about what's going on there with China and mining. But the stories are amazing, what they're extracting from very poor countries in Africa, and what goes on when you think about what we're able to accomplish here around mining. The other countries are impacted in ways we just can't even imagine anymore. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that was really interesting for me to learn about in this research is how much we might mine something here and then we actually export it to China to be processed, because our air quality standards are so high that it's cheaper to ship it to China to be processed and then ship it back here. So that was really fascinating. And the other part is that China has done a lot of colonization actually in Afghanistan, because they have huge repositories of rare earth elements. And those rare earth elements are what make different colors in our cell phone. And so if you want to be innovative in the cellular technology game, you really have to have access to those rare earth elements. So it's just kind of seeing all of those things, how they interrelate. And so every time a new iPhone comes out, I kind of cringe, because many people don't see where those are coming from, but like I work on that. I see the mile down hole 3 miles wide and what that's like, and the critical impact that we make. So I know we want to kind of get going. I just have a few more slides. I'm going to continue on. We're going to come back to Stefan's question about Indigenous sustainability, because that's something I'm all about. So
I think that was Trace's question.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, maybe it's really everybody's question, but Trace is the one who raised it, I think. And Lydia, let's be sure we have a couple of minutes for people to write some more questions on their own, but please carry on.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't been keeping track of the chat quite as much, so thank you for bringing it up, Stuart. Unfortunately, my computer is a little on the fritz about the chat. Okay, so I think as Holly mentioned, there's kind of these 4 different pillars that are often arguing amongst one another, these social, human, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainability. And I think there's often a question of, if it comes to environmental versus economic, or social versus economic interactions, we know that economic sustainability tends to be the one that prevails more. But increasingly, climate, I mean, you're seeing huge banks divest in oil and coal mining because of environmental sustainability and climate change. So I think that those are really important considerations as we look forward. There's also this human and social components of sustainability. The differentiation of them, right, is thinking about humans, and just as Holly also mentioned, the systemic racism components versus social, of how we interact with using these different types of resources. But ultimately, it's really avoiding the depletion of our natural resources to maintain this ecological balance so that all of us can really live in our beautiful planet, in particular our Sonoran Desert. And so this is where I wanted to kind of come back to bringing Indigenous sustainability. And so Native people, we have a long history of being sustainable. Thinking about our traditional housing materials, even concrete. We use things like soil and adobe. We use a lot of traditional like fire burning practices that really come to attention in 2020 with the big fires that we've had, really living within our means of our traditional food systems. And I often say that we're kind of the creators of the leave no trace concepts, because many people have a hard time finding, for the most part, finding a lot of Indigenous villages. You'll see artifacts here or there, but a lot of our traditional housing practices, our land management practices, didn't really leave a trace before that was a common belief or common outdoors ethic. But also I think circling back to how Indigenous peoples and our knowledge of our ecosystems are really critical to thinking about land management practices and our world's food systems and how to keep them sustainable. Though we only make up less than 5% of the population, we still manage more than a quarter of the world's land surface. And including our forest ecosystems, and maintain them in similar practices when that knowledge is still retained as they have been. So I think this is where it comes back to, it's really important for us to continue to support and learn from Indigenous land rights and sovereignty. You all are doing that here today and listening to this presentation, to thinking about these traditional food practices and really minimizing impact. And also recognize that for many nations, they haven't been able to continue those practices because of the influence of colonization and how that's impacted our relationship with one another, with our land systems. And many people are continuing to reach back to those traditions and really find them. So this is a photo, by the way, of me out with a friend, Amy Wan, who's at them and harvesting saguaro fruit, a very delicious traditional food. So I think that's kind of, we can definitely talk more about Indigenous sustainability, what that means and how do you measure it. There are a fair amount of Indigenous scholars really thinking and talking about Indigenous sustainability, whether it comes to water, food. I think about it a lot in terms of energy and how do our traditional languages talk about energy before English came into our lexicon. And just as a kind of cliff note to that is that when we look at Indigenous languages, in my own, it's around sun. I know some friends who are Hawaiian, they talk about the word for energy is around water. Other friends, it's around wind. So I feel like our Indigenous languages teach us about energy in the context of our environment. But as a lot of those language speakers are being lost, we're losing that knowledge system, which is why it's so critical to also support language revitalization programs. So again, I kind of think sustainability is a really important concept. I often think about sustainability for whom. So I'm an avid trail runner, and I often run up to the peak of Mount Wrightson and look over at these mining sites, one of which I work on, right? And I think a lot about what it must have been like to be on this peak for my ancestors, to not see what those are like. And then as we talk about mining in the future, and if Southern Arizona becomes a Silicon Valley of mining, what it might look like for my future children and their grandchildren, and if they'll still see mountains in the future, if it will be more of these mining facilities. And that really informs me of the kind of work that I do and how vitally important it is. And then also, again, kind of talking about how we export pollution. These are some mines, artisanal mines in Ghana, so they're not by big mining companies, but how many Indigenous people around the world are incentivized to really degrade their land systems, and how do we work to change that? And so really constantly on that question on my mind, as we talked about the lithium mines as well, is sustainability as we make solar energy panels here, but sustainable for whom, and what power dynamics are involved in that are a really critical part of this conversation. And it's really critical that both Indigenous and Black and people of color are leading these conversations because they're often the most impacted by this. And then lastly is just really what is, and I think I talked about this a little bit, about what is our responsibility to the land and to those who follow after us. And I hope that my kids will be able to see mountains in the Sonoran Desert and be able to run up them as I have, but I don't know. And that's something that really haunts me. So I guess in concluding thoughts, I just want to really encourage everyone to support these Indigenous land rights that are critical to sustainability and their land management practices. I think everyone's already doing this, as I saw in the comments, right? But really critically assess our purchasing decisions and how those affect the places we love, and really know that soil health is something that we're still really understanding, but it's a critical component to our soil, to our climate solutions in the future. And so I'm a big soil lover, and so I hope to share that love for soils with you all today. And then I think whoever you are, connecting to your traditional ancestry and those traditional knowledges and language are really important to helping us understand how they saw their relationships with the land and with one another, and how that can guide us in solutions moving forward. So with that, I want to say Lose Nakane. So thank you for your time. I know I really appreciate you spending your Saturday with me to talk about these issues I could talk for days about. So thank you. And then just thank you also to my research group who supported me in really bringing into these knowledge systems together. And so with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydia. Much appreciated. Now, do you want to stay and see our questions? Yeah, we got a lot of hands showing there.
I can stay for 12 more minutes and then I have to go.
Then would you be willing to show your slides from beginning to end in slow motion? And that way, that might stimulate some of our thinking. Now, Barb and Kurt have already put in about 3 quiz questions. And why don't we each type at least one in this few minutes we've got? See how many quiz questions you can put into the chat box, and I'll collect those and share them later. So everyone, go ahead and start typing. And Lydia, if you're willing to share on the screen again, just
Sure.
give each slide, I don't know, 5-10 seconds, just so we can be reminded.
Yes, let me get back to that. Okay. So I'm gonna skip over this slide. Should I just keep going until you tell me to stop?
Sure. Why don't you pause there for a moment, give maybe 5 seconds in case that stimulates something. And just kind of go at an easy pace.
Okay. I'm sorry, when I'm in slide mode, I can't see your comments, so I apologize for that.
Question on that one, Lydia.
There's a question on here? Okay, let's see.
Are the 66 states recognized tribes separate from the 567? Are those in addition to?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So not every tribal nation that's federally recognized is recognized by the states, and not every state recognizes the federally recognized tribes. So it's kind of an inverse relationship there.
So now I'm confused. Are the 567 and the 66 2 separate categories, or is there some overlap?
2 separate categories.
Got it. Thank you.
And one thing I will say to kind of add on to this is that I think it's really exciting that we potentially have an Indigenous woman being our Department of Interior Secretary, because I think it's really going to change our understanding of Indigenous nations and land sovereignty moving forward. So.
Lydia?
Yes.
Perhaps they can change that ancient mining law. Don't they have a law still that says they can come and seize any land for mining purposes?
Yeah, there was
federal government.
There's the 1872 general mining law that I don't know how it's lasted for 150 years, but it has. And that one is really pretty alarming. And that's also, see, I could go on forever about this, but that's also how a lot of land exchanges happen. So like the Resolution copper mine, that was put into a Department of Defense bill at the last minute under John McCain. And that one in particular said it's an issue of national security, so therefore they should be able to allow to mine here. So things like that do happen with the 1872 General Mining Law.
And isn't that what they're doing with Oak Flat as well?
Yeah, that's the same. The Resolution Copper Mine and Oak Flat are the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna slowly keep going.
Take 3 more minutes for the quiz questions or questions that pop up once you see.
Okay. I'll try to.
I'm going to throw in a random question, Lydia. Can we build soil faster than 1,000 years simply by putting compost on it?
Can we rebuild or can we build soil?
Well, you just said it takes 1,000 years to build a topsoil.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, soil is basically eroded geology, right?
With organic matter and biological elements.
Right. And there are artificial things that you can do to degrade the parent material. There are things that you can do to add to it. But it's still, I mean, to build up a soil that's like in the Sonoran Desert, it takes a couple years just to build up the soil itself. So if either way, it's going to be a really time-consuming process. If you are building up a new soil, it's going to take around 1,000 years. But if you're building up a previously degraded soil, that can happen in under 10 years, depending on the factors.
Thank you. That's hopeful.
And I will just kind of give a plug that there have been a fair amount of studies really on that topic at the Biosphere 2. They have it's called the Lea the Landscape Observatory Experiment. And so they're doing exactly that, of looking at basaltic rock and how long it takes to make it into soils, and studying the different angles and microbes that can be associated with that.
It looks like we've finished our spree of quiz question writing.
Okay.
So Lydia, I would like to formally thank you on behalf of everybody here for what was, I see a lot of nodding heads. This was, I believe, quite exciting, enlightening, and hope-inducing. Knowing there's someone like you with this knowledge, this energy, both physical, emotional, and psychological, gives us a lot of reason to feel good about the future. And I believe that we all will find ways to carry forward some of your counsel, whether it's becoming more discriminating about our purchases and passing that on, taking better care of our soil, or as an organization that educates and advocating for changes of law, such as that 1872 law, so that we're not stuck with a lot of backpedaling and trying to clean up after someone else's mess. I'd like to acknowledge someone who has been invisible but very present today, and that's Sharia Desjardins. She is responsible really for our being here today, because several months ago she said, "Stuart, what about that ambassador thing we were talking about last year?" And thus began a conversation, which has culminated in our practice. And Danye, also another strong advocate, Trace as a board member for Sustainable Tucson, giving great support to the program. So Lydia, we thank you. I'll be in touch with you for some technical things we want to cover after. I'll send you an email.
Great. Well,
Any
thank you all
last,
for having me and for spending your Saturday with me and listening to me talk for soil about so long. And I also say for the quality questions, I felt like I got as grilled here as I did in my dissertation defense, and in a really positive way. So thank you all so much. It's really hopeful also to know that I have such engaged community members within Tucson.
yes, and there are many more besides us. We are a fraction. Okay,
Have a
well,
good Saturday.
okay, we'll be in touch with you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. And by the way, Robin has said some nice things about sustainability, and I captured those in my notes. Robin and Danielle are both leaders of our groups, as many of you know. Robin is the leader of the Habitat Restoration Committee group. So someone who gets her hands in the soil and feet on the ground and gets other people as well. Danielle is spearheading our outreach to nonprofits and charitable groups, as Barb was talking about, to help them improve their green profile. Kevin and Sharia are the leads on our Zero Waste Committee. So hats off to you all. Danya and I will be hosting our 3 p.m. workshop. For those, I know a couple of you are going to be there. Get outside when you can, because at 3 o'clock we've got climate change communication with Dwayne Ediger, one of our board members, who is a solar installer and is a scholar of the topic. He's got background in doing nonviolent conflict resolution in earlier years. And then John Francis, the man who went silent for 17 years to bear witness to the problems of fossil fuels, and now he's a professor of environmental science. We'll talk about environment, race, and equity. And then the big piece will be two more people from UA. An assistant professor recently got her doctorate a few years ago, and one of her graduate students is going to share with us some principles of environmental communication. And many of those were embodied in Lydia today, and they will highlight for us some things we can keep in mind as we do our education and advocacy.